Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the second chapter in the book of Lamentations. And if the theme of the first is the sorrow is existing in the city of Jerusalem, the theme of the second is Yahweh's righteous anger over sin. And the word anger or fury or some synonym of the word appears 8 times in this book, whereas in the previous chapter, verse 12, I think we read it once. Well, in some translations it's there, but also the word comfort appears but once in the second chapter. But before we read and comment about what we read of Yahweh's righteous wrath over his reprobate city, which was in ruins and shambles because of their covenant violations. So the sorrow that they were experiencing in verse 1 was in direct result to Yahweh's righteous wrath that we read of in the second chapter. So what we read in the first opening verse, how alone she sits, the city once great with people, like a widow she has become, one great among the nations, a princess among provinces, has become a slave. So this is Jeremiah writing, and he's writing about how his once prominent, rich, wealthy, prestigious city was laying in ruins, a shambles of its former self. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. The friends were the Egyptian and pagan nation allies that the prophets had warned the secular kings to put their trust in Yahweh and not with unreliable and untrustworthy Gentile powers. They could not save them. They were not there to help them now that they were gone. She has no rest. That's Judah, so there's nothing but commotion and warfare and mayhem in her midst ever since it was been sacked by the Babylonians. All the splendor has departed, so what was once radiant and magnificent was now a flicker, a shadow of its former self. Look and see if there is any pain like my pain. Now, Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. He experienced pain just like more so than anyone else, because what he had warned about would come to pass if Judah remained wayward and retrobate from the covenant path. He was living in what he had warned about to become, and he felt personal pain, and plus the anguish of having a 40-year ministry which went neglected and unheeded. He has made my strength stumble. Yahweh has given me into his hands, which I am unable to withstand. So he places a lot of the blame square at the shoulder of Yahweh, whose servant he was, and it's easy to sneer at Jeremiah for feeling abandoned and forsaken in the predicament that he found him in, but these are entirely human expressions and questions that we ourselves would have were our positions reversed. And, the word comforter appears in the 16th verse. He feels bereft and absent of his comforter in this and several other verses. So this is just his own sorrow in the city. Now in the second chapter we read of Yahweh's righteous anger at sin, and like 4 of the chapters in the book of Lamentations, it's a short book of 5 chapters. It is arranged in an acrostic, which is a Hebrew literary device whereby each word begins with the letter as they appear in alphabetic order in the Hebrew language. And we're probably only going to make it up to the 11th verse today just because time pending, but we will pick this up and continue this at a later date. So the opening verse reads, how Yahweh in his displeasure has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud. He has cast down from the heavens to the earth the comeliness of Israel, and he has not remembered his foot still. So why was Yahweh displeased? And the displeased is because the chosen people, the ones he had through his grace exalted and uplifting to be an exalted mission to bless all the nations of the earth and to give witness to a world which was completely estranged from him. They were living indistinct from the pagans. They were living as if the covenant consequences didn't exist, and then he finally had to bring it upon them to remind him how displeased they had made him over a period of several hundred years. So he is a long-suffering creature, but his tolerance and his patience have limits. Zion would have been the site, center, and location of the Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred site. We learned earlier in the first chapter that it had been destroyed irrevocably, and this was for daring to suggest to kings, to offer the line of advice to Hezekiah to surrender without resistance to the Babylonians in the interest of preserving the temple. He was thrown in a dungeon, and of course the temple was destroyed. He who created the heavens and the earth is able to cast down from the heavens to the earth, and the comeliness of Israel really was a beautiful nation. There's really no nation quite like it on earth. And the footstool is his earth, the heavens is his throne, the earth is his footstool, and that is why the earth is so dirty. But Jeremiah is expressing it as if he did not even remember his earth. Yahweh has swallowed up without compassion all the pastures of Jacob. In his wrath he has thrown down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought them down to the ground. He has profaned the kingdom and its rulers. So a lot of these statements can be interpreted as doubtful and faithless, but one thing we cannot call them is honesty. This was Jeremiah's sincere expression to what he was going through at this moment in time. The independent nation of Judah was a treasure to these people, these former slaves, who had somehow squandered it through not living up to their exalted calling. But to accuse Yahweh without having mercy, now he is a generally merciful creature, but he also writes, he will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, somewhere in Exodus. So one of the mysteries is, everything he does is righteous, so is there any element of favoritism on who he has mercy for? And all of us need mercy, but none of us strictly speaking deserve it, but some of us deserve it more than others. In his wrath we're just going to move on to verse 3. In the day of displeasure he has cut off every horn of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand from before the enemy, and he burns against Jacob like a flaming fire, consuming all around. So fire is one of the forms of his manifestation. It was through smoke that he led the Israelites by night, I believe, during the Exodus generation. And he often, at the famous contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, he revealed himself through fire there. And he revealed himself in the bush which burned but did not consume to Moses. So fire is one of his frequent forms, but he's also consuming fire. We read of in Hebrews 12:29, which cites its original citation can be found in the book of Deuteronomy. But he burns against Jacob, his chosen people. And why would he do that? Because as his chosen people, they had lofty demands and tremendous responsibilities, and they collectively were derelict in this duty, thus inviting his wrath and his fire, which it's likened to. He has bent his bow like an enemy. He has appointed his right hand as an adversary. He slays all whom delighted the eye in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his wrath like fire. So once more he envisions Yahweh militarily against him, violently opposed to him. He has a bow in his hand and he's aiming it at Judah, who he is also burning at the same time, and Mount Zion, which by this time is just a mountain. There's no temple on it. But Yahweh, who they had counted as their friend and ally, was treating them like an enemy, and rightly so, because before he declared them an enemy, they had declared themselves his enemy. Perhaps not officially out loud or in writing, but the way they were living, they were clearly enemies of the ones who had called them friends. Yahweh has been like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces. He has destroyed her strongholds and increased mourning and lamentation. So once more, Yahweh had acted like an enemy and did the things that an enemy would do, which was to consume whole Israel. Every person in the land, except the most impoverished, were packed up and carted away to Babylon. And the palaces, the once magnificent palaces, were in devastation and ruin. They had been ransacked by the plunderers and looters of Nebuchadnezzar, who also got rid of their strategically necessary military fortifications, leaving them bereft of protection, even if there were people still living there. And there were, a small amount of people. And all of this has resulted in tremendous grief, mourning, and lamentation. And this is the title of the book we find. And it consists of expressions of lamentations. So this book is also, even though we, in the English Bible, we classify it as prophetic, in the Hebrew original Bible, it is in fact belongs to the writings. There are three genres of the what the Old Testament people call the Old Testament: the law, the writing, and the prophets. There aren't any prophecies in this book, but what he's doing is writing in response to the fulfillment of prophecies that he himself had predicted would come to pass. He has demolished his booth like a garden. He has destroyed his place of meeting. Yahweh has made the appointed times and Sabbath to be forgotten in Zion, and despised kings and priests in his raging displeasure. So his booth would have been his temple. That was after the tabernacle, the temple was believed to be the center of his dwelling and presence, and it was reduced to a garden because there was no building there anymore. And this was the place of his meeting, the place of gathering, the place of congregation for sacrifices and the most sacred holidays of the Jewish holiday year. And, the appointed times, those are the holidays, and the Sabbath were no more because the temple was no more. There were no more priests to enforce them or remind them. and they're forgotten in Zion because there's no temple there. And the king and the priest, the king Zedekiah had his eyes gouged out, and the priest were without a temple, so they were wandering vagabonds. Of course, there was still some priest in Babylon, but it's all because of his raging displeasure, and his wrath and anger and fury are completely merited, completely just, and completely righteous. Yahweh has cast off his altar. He has rejected his temple. He has delivered the walls of her palaces into the hand of the enemy. They have been made a noise in the house of Yahweh, as on the day of the appointed time. So why would he cast away that which belonged to him and was especially dedicated to him? And the answer is because it was not fulfilling its divinely designed intention to draw others to him, to be a place of fellowship. It was a house of merchandise that we read of in the book of Jeremiah. It was a center of commerce, so he just, the walls, the kings were not living by the law. They were not setting the example. They were leading the nation astray by betraying their vassals and seeking alliances against them. And that's what's ultimately drew them into the hand of the enemy. And the house of Yahweh, they had made a noise in it, but the house of Yahweh is in smithereens. It's been reduced to nothing right now. Yahweh has planned to destroy the walls of the daughter of Zion. He has stretched out a line. He has not turned back his hand from destroying. And he has made the rampart and wall to lament. Together they have languished. So what Yahweh determines, you can bet your bottom dollar will come to pass. So his mind is oriented on destruction, and the walls and the temple in Zion are the aim of his target, and he's set his hand in motion to destroy, and once he does that, he's not going to turn it back. He's not going to relent on his resolve. And the rampart and wall is meant to lament, just like we read that word or lamentation somewhat earlier in the same chapter, and that once more is the title of this book. And together they're going to languish. That means deteriorate, decay, and eventually be no more. And before that comes, it's really just progressively less of a shadow of its former self. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has destroyed and broken her bars. Her kings and her rulers are among the Gentiles. The Torah is no more, and her prophets have found no vision from Yahweh. So the gates, the protective entrance and exit points of the walls of every ancient city were no more. They were in the ground, they were not above ground, and therefore were useless. And the bars which, form the gate, they're not there, so the gate's essentially wide open, even if it wasn't underground. Her kings and her rulers, be they secular or ecclesiastes, are now among the Gentiles, and the law is no more. And her prophets, at this moment in time, have found no vision. There is no vision to be had, but the fire of the torch of prophecy would not be extinguished in the exile or in the early exile. Ezekiel and Daniel, and then Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi would keep the torch lit beyond this point. But at this moment in time, even Jeremiah, who was a prophet, one of the major ones, had no prophecy to proclaim, because there was none to be had. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground, are silent. They have thrown dust on their heads. They have girded themselves with sackcloth. The maidens of Jerusalem have let their hands hang to the ground. So the females are lamenting and weeping and mourning and grieving over their current state. They're going through the motions of ritualistic repentance, the sackcloth, the itchy clothes. The sackcloth would have been the itchy clothes, so it would have been less than comfortable, hence signifying and identifying one in the mourning process. And dust, that no one likes to pour dust on their head unless they're repenting, and that's something one does only out of abject humility. And once more, sackcloth, and they have not let their heads hang to the ground. That means they're not pointing up, they're looking upwards to heaven, to ask for their forgiveness and to notice that they are repentant. Final verse of the section we're going to be covering today, verse 11. My eyes are spent with tears, my inward parts ferment. My bile has been poured on the ground because of the destruction of the daughters of my people. As children and the infants languish in the street of this city. So Jeremiah is once more the weeping prophet. He shed many tears. He lamented, he grieved, he mourned, and he had plenty of cause and reason to. And especially at this time, he felt it on his inside and in his bowels. And the cause and motivating of his displeasure was the destruction of the daughter of my people. His people were Judah and Jerusalem. And the sight of children and infants who themselves were innocent of any of the sin, their parents' sins, their parents, their grandparents, and everyone else's sin was being visited upon them. They were being punished for something they didn't even do. And Jeremiah was also bearing the brunt of the punishment because he was not a partaker in the sins of the nation. He was the prophet, but nevertheless he was not spared the consequences of the covenantal violation. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.